the underprotection that comes from smartphones and social media is that they act as experience blockers. They prevent us from having the play and having the crucial developmental experiences that we need as children and then as adolescents in order to become flourishing adults. And it's kind of messing with the process that has been developed over millennia.
Hello, Zach. Thank you for being with us today. It's a real pleasure to have you on the show.
Yeah, Victor, thanks for inviting me on. I'm really excited to talk to you.
First, before we start dwelling into kids' mental health issues, can you tell us a bit about your personal story and what led you to work on psychology and technology?
Yeah. So there were three really important moments in my life that kind of got me to where I am today. It's a bit of a long story, but I'll try to do it nice and condensed. But it was actually back in 2012. I was 18 years old. I was out on a gap year program after high school, and I was in the middle of the Amazon rainforest in Ecuador. And I was actually given a very strong hallucinogenic tea at the time. And I didn't know. I had never taken any. The vast majority of my substance use background, I'm Jewish, so it was just at temple when I'd go on Shabbat. So I really didn't have much of a background there. And so that night I had the first panic attack of my life. And it set off this chain of very severe anxiety that I had for the next, I still have, but it lasted for over a decade. And that set off this like very long journey for me of trying to understand my own brain, understanding mental health. And then eventually the kind of second seminal point was I ended up on another trip. This time it was a trip to go backpacking and rock climbing for a month out in the United States in Wyoming with another program. And then I got really into that. And then I ended up at a wilderness therapy program where I actually was working. And that's where I would go out and take kids who were struggling, backpacking, rock climbing, canoeing out in the woods for up to a month at a time. And that experience working there was just absolutely transformative for me. I don't know about the kids, but for me at least, it changed the way that I understood myself. I, was this anxious, depressed, suicidal kid, and I was consistently being given more and more responsibility by the heads of this program who, for whatever reason, trusted in me. And my anxiety didn't go away, but what changed for me was this sense of internal strength and competence that I could do more than I thought. And that is what led me to go to graduate school ultimately. And I studied psychological science, and I was at a small state school in New York. And I came across John Haidt's book, The Coddling of the American Mind. And in that book, he talked about this almost entire generation of kids just around my age. And I'm 29. I'm like a late millennial. But the late millennials and Gen Z who were suddenly going to the mental health centers on college campuses at an unprecedented rate. And I really resonated with that because of my own experience. And I also really resonated with a lot of the ideas from his book. And so I did some research on it. I connected with John through that. And then he assigned me to start trying to understand the scope of this crisis, just how big it is. And that's how I got here. And it's a personal issue for me as well.
Si tu apprécies cette chaîne, pense à t'abonner et à activer la cloche. Et n'hésite pas à donner de la visibilité à cette vidéo en la likant, en la partageant ou en la commentant. La Fabrique sociale est un média indépendant et a grand besoin de soutien financier. Si tu en as les moyens, n'hésite pas à faire un don sur ma page Tipeee. Même les petits gestes sont très importants pour la survie de cette chaîne. Le lien est disponible dans les notes et dans les commentaires.
I saw that you study evolutionary psychology. Is that right?
Yes,
Yeah.
so I went to, in graduate school, my focus was social psychology and evolutionary psychology, and I have a really deep interest in understanding how evolution and our early, Homo sapien experience still impacts us on a day-to-day level, and it's really actually critical to the way that I see what's happening today.
Yeah, about that, can you expand a little bit about the upsides of studying contemporary problems through evolutionary lenses?
Absolutely. I think that, first of all, right now we're living through a period of unprecedented technological change. And there's this amazing quote from E.O. Wilson, the biologist, who said, we have, what is it?
Paleofical.
Yes,
emotions?
Paleolithic minds, Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology. And, I think that quote sums it all up in terms of how the problems that we're facing today is how do we merge and work with Paleolithic emotions and godlike technology at the same time. And there's this concept in evolutionary psychology called evolutionary mismatch, which is a very simple idea, but it's that we evolved in a certain kind of world, a world of scarce resources, for example, with very little sugar. And when we find sugar, my God, we're going to have as much as we can, and into a world that we live in now where, my God, there is sugar everywhere. Get this away from me because I can't stop eating it. And that's the difference between the two worlds. And there's this mismatch between what we evolved for and what we currently have. And technology, again, is just, it's the sugar, it's the analogous sugar of communication, of social life. And it's really wreaked havoc. And we can talk more about that.
Yeah, sure. I interviewed Peter Gray a couple months ago on this podcast. You must know him. We talked about the importance of play in human evolution. What's your take on this topic? And what do you think is the role of play in kids' mental health crisis?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And maybe let me step back and just
Sure.
tell a little bit about what I'm currently working on and then how this fits in,
Sure.
because play is central. So I'm working with Jonathan Haidt at New York University on the new book that will be released on March 26 called The Anxious Generation: How the Great Rewiring of Childhood is Causing an Epidemic of Mental Illness. And in the book, we trace out the international youth mental health crisis that has hit adolescents, and particularly adolescent girls, extremely hard. And I can go into, later on the data really showing and illustrating the trends. But the primary thesis of the book is that we've been making two well-meaning but big mistakes overall. And that's that we've been overprotecting kids in the real world and underprotecting them online. And the two of those forces are the driving causes of what we believe is driving this mental health crisis. And so the overprotection in the real world is all about the swallowing up of time that used to be spent in what we called the play-based childhood, where we had an enormous amount of unsupervised mixed-age play with other kids, and how that got subsumed by time with parents, structured activities, school, and then this technological world that completely took over life altogether and turned into what we called the phone-based childhood. And so our key argument is that childhood had been changing for a long time through overprotection. But then right around 2010 is when the phone-based childhood takes over from the play-based childhood completely. And it is the years 2010 to 2015 where we really see this rapid transformation of teenage social life as a result of changes in technology. But that backstory is still very important to us.
So about the role of play in our human evolution, what's your take on this subject?
Yeah, so we both John and I draw heavily from Peter, and the core idea is that play is the work of childhood. We are given through evolution this very long period that seems evolutionarily disadvantageous. We grow very quickly for like 5-6 years, and then we kind of stop, and we're just these like little weak human beings running around and just asking for predators to eat us. And it seems like, why the heck did we do this? Why would evolution have provided this for us? And our key theoretical model for this period of childhood is that it's a cultural apprenticeship. We are given around 10 years of time to master the skills, the language, the all the social dynamics of what it is to be human and what makes us very unique as a species during that period of time. And so play is crucial. Play is the primary motivation that we have to do the things, to learn all of these skills, to become part of the human tribe. And so part of what we're so concerned about is that both overprotection and also the underprotection that comes from smartphones and social media and other digital media is that they act as experience blockers. They prevent us from having the play and having the crucial developmental experiences that we need as children and then as adolescents in order to become flourishing adults. And it's kind of messing with the process that has been developed over millennia.
In your opinion, did the philosophy of parenthood change the way we view play? Does this change happened before the democratization of smartphones?
Yeah, good question. So yes, I think the history of play is really interesting and very long, and definitely not my area of expertise. I think Peter probably spoke much more eloquently than I can on this. But the big picture for us is that what we understood as the play-based childhood was in full force mostly before the 1970s. But then towards the end of the 70s, and this is specifically in the Anglo countries, is there was a rising fearfulness that was driven by new cable television that was just coming out, and we started to see the worst kind of news stories about things happening to kids. And in the United States, it wasn't only you'd see on TV, you'd had these milk cartons that you'd get at the grocery store that had the pictures of kids' face who had gone missing. And what happened during this period of time, and it's quite remarkable when we look at the graphs, is the degree of trust that adults had in other adults collapsed very rapidly. And so we have this change in the 80s and early 90s of adults stopping trusting other people and depending almost entirely on themselves. And this is a radical change in parenthood, because before this period, there is that saying, and it's very true, that it takes a village to raise a child. And it was very much the case that back in the 1950s, for example, if you lived in New York City, like my grandfather, you would leave school and then you would go out and play on the streets until the streetlights came on at night. And what was crucial was his parents weren't watching, but his friends' parents and then some other adults that they knew were watching. And it was this kind of collective upbringing that happened, where you can kind of outsource a lot of things to other people while the kids played together. And so what ended up happening was that social trust started to dissolve. And then we started to spend much more time raising our own kids and supervising them constantly, while also putting them into highly structured activities and schooling. And so the experience of childhood really, really changed. And we believe it accelerated in the 1990s to become more structured and more supervised, and then changed again in the early 2010s once the smartphones and social media came on board.
Let's talk more about the fun-based childhood. You put a tremendous amount of work in order to understand if and when smartphones and the digital started to affect Gen Z mental health. Can you walk us through what you found? And maybe we can start by defining what is Gen Z?
Yeah, great question. So Gen Z is the generation of kids who were born in and after 1996. And then there's, we're still figuring out when does Gen Z end. Some people say 2012, and we're moving into Gen Alpha. But there is a case to be made that that Gen Z could be it's a longer span. So there's still questions about when Gen Z ends.
When did Gen Z mental health really started to decline, and what are the links? What are the links that you establish between this decline and the digital?
So the way I think we need to start talking about this is to actually go back to the mental health data to start, and then I'll move into the tech world, because it is the specific pattern of mental health problems that helps point us in the direction of where to look for the cause. So when we look at, let's just say, the United States, what happens is that before 2010, rates of anxiety, depression, self-harm, suicide, if we just start around 1995 or so, it's relatively steady across all these measures among adolescents. Girls are typically a little higher than boys in all measures except for suicide, where boys are almost always about 3 times higher than girls. But across the board, those were relatively steady. Things were doing okay. And then right around 2010, for all of these measures, these start to shoot up. And it's not just a kind of a soft upturn, it's an elbow in the curve. So something really changed right around 2010 through 2015. Now, there are a couple other really important points. One is they're specifically internalizing disorders. So things like, as I'm saying, anxiety, depression, inward towards the self, some sort of self hatred or lack of self-worth or something there, not externalizing disorders. In fact, externalizing problems like physical fighting and physical aggression more broadly had actually been declining during this same period. And so it's the specific type of disorders at the specific time, and it's also among specific people. So it's hit hardest adolescent girls, 10 to 19 years old, in that period. Boys also went up, but when we look at measures of depression, anxiety, and self-harm, they all go up at the same time in the same way, and it's happening in many countries around the world. So I found the same trends in the 5 major Anglosphere countries, so US, UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. We find it in the similar trends in the Nordic countries. And then I've also done some work looking on mainland Europe more broadly, and finding the same thing happening in Western Europe. And of course, there's some variation, and we could talk about that. But all of this is to say, oh, and the last point is that it's mostly happening among teens and not adults. And so putting all of those pieces together, international pattern, it's happening among teens, hitting girls the hardest, internalizing disorders right around 2010, it really narrows in the possible explanations for what could have caused this change. So now with that long-winded answer, let me move into what happened in the technological world that also ties in here. And that is that what we had in the early 2000s was kind of like the building of the technological spaceship. We started, early social media platforms were developed like MySpace and Friendster. And you have, laptops becoming much more common. It's more access to the internet. But generally during this time, again, mental health was not really getting worse. But then things start to change as we move towards the end of the decade. And so in 2007, we get the smartphone. And the smartphone, again, still is not all that problematic at first. It has the internet, or like email. It's a phone, and you can access the internet, phone, and email. And then things start to change very quickly. In 2008, we get the App Store, which allows other third-party companies to come in and compete with each other to create the best apps. And what does the best apps means? It means the most engaging, the most likely to be clicked on. And so a new dynamic really starts to emerge after that. So in 2009, we get Facebook adds the like button, Twitter adds the retweet button. We get push notifications where you get notices all throughout the day. And then in 2010, you get the front-facing camera. And what's true about all of these things is that they make social media much more viral, much more addictive, and much more about platforming oneself to an audience rather than something that is just about networking with people that known people. And also in 2010, you get the first social media platform designed specifically for a smartphone. None of the other platforms before that, they were changing to fit into the smartphone. Instagram was made for the smartphone. And by 2012, Facebook buys Instagram and the user base really takes off. And it's between this and these years, from 2009 to 2015, is when teenage social life moves almost entirely onto these platforms. So in 2009, for example, just around, I think it's a little under 50% of American teens are using social media platforms every day. By 2012, that goes up to 75%. By 2015, American teenage girls are 15% of them. This comes from Monitoring the Future, a major US national survey, found that 15% say that they're spending more than 40 hours per week just on social media platforms. By 2022, Pew Research found that 46% of teens are say that they're online almost all the time. And about 1/3, I believe, say that it's one of the 5 major social media platforms. And so the point of all of that is to say that in a very short period of time, where kids were, what kids were doing, how kids were interacting, moved from the real world primarily into this new hyper-viral and addictive virtual world that we believe is unstable and not fit for young people.
The mental health crisis is affecting way more girls than boys, so it appears so. Can you tell us in more detail about the difference between the way girls are reacting to social media and the way boys are reacting to it?
Yeah. So the simple explanation for why, and it's not just in the mental health trends, it's also in a large body of research. What we always find consistently is that when you look at the relationship between social media usage and things like depression, anxiety, self-worth, body image, it's almost always significant for girls, especially adolescent girls. And then it's more nuanced and more varied among boys. So we see this in the research too. And what's, the simple explanation is just that girls use social media way more than boys do. On average, yes, girls are on social media, and boys on average are playing video games, and also pornography is very common among boys, way less common among girls. And that is, that tells us where to look for the different problems. Now, social media also is particularly harmful to girls for a variety of other reasons. Some being the fact that boys' aggression tends to be more physical. Girls' aggression, on average, tends to be more relational. And most people know this intuitively, but if you move aggression and social life onto these platforms, you get this new kind of cyberbullying, which creates an entirely new dynamic where not only are you being relationally bullied by someone in your class, that bullying is now prominent for everybody to see. Sometimes it's anonymous, and it happens 24/7. So your bully can follow you home, you can follow you to your bedroom, to your bathroom, in ways that was really not possible a decade ago. So you can never escape this virtual world. So cyberbullying is just one example, and it happens to both boys and girls. But since relational aggression is so much higher, it's happening more to girls. Another mechanism of harm for girls is around visual social comparison, which tends to be a major issue for girls for a variety of different reasons. But being constantly exposing and sharing oneself and one's life on these platforms to be judged by others, and also using highly manufactured filtering and highly crafted photos and videos of oneself is particularly detrimental to one's sense of self and one's sense of self-worth. And it's this constant social comparison and constant public performance of oneself that induces an enormous amount of stress and anxiety. And I'll just do one more, which is just online predation is something that is particularly a harm that is happening towards girls. And just to give one stat here, there's a former Facebook senior official. His name is Arturo Bejar, and he testified recently against Meta. And he in his testimony stated that I believe it's 13%, or maybe, no, sorry, 15% of 13 to 15-year-old children have been contacted for some sort of sexual solicitation within the last 7 days. Right. So this just tells the story of just the extent of interaction with strangers and people that you don't know. And it creates this experience of childhood that is performative, that is stressful, and that is completely unregulated.
Yeah. To support this claim, every time I work with kids in my organization and I exchange with them, there's always someone to tell me that a girl, most of the time, has been contacted on Snapchat by strangers, and most of the time it's adults, and it's for sexual solicitation. And as you must know, the big tech CEOs testified in front of the Senate. I think it was a month ago, and that's when they confronted the big tech CEOs with this stat that in the last 7 days, tens of millions of kids received sexual unwanted sexual solicitation. That's pretty crazy.
Yeah, it is really crazy. And I think it's something that most kids and even parents don't fully understand, because when we look at our own feeds and when we look, especially as adults, if I go and open up Instagram or whatever, right, the algorithm, it feeds me content that I tend to like. And it's generally, for me, it's like politically polarizing and I get all angry, but I know what I'm expecting, and and often there's some good videos, but the experience for kids, especially the most vulnerable kids, the kinds of content that is being pushed towards them constantly is, it's often sexual. It's just feeding into their insecurities, and they're being contacted. And the other piece is that, the vast majority of online life is public. So even though it might feel private, that you're just sharing stuff for your friends, adults can go on TikTok and save a video, and they have it on their desktop. Like, this is not a place that is really safe. And for children, especially young girls going through puberty, is where we see the biggest harm. And we need to rethink, I believe, our relationship to these technologies and what information that we choose to put out there.
Yeah, sure. 5 years ago, I read the book iGen by Professor Jean Twenge. I was pretty stunned by the trends that are depicted in this book. So she talks about the way kids are in less and less relationships. They don't go dating anymore. They get their driver's license later and later in life. Apart from mental health, what are the tangible differences between Gen Z and older generations? Did you study other metrics?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, okay, the way that I want to go at this question is actually just one more kind of piece around the harms of the phone-based childhood that are a little bit broader, and I think can get us to the question of what makes Gen Z different from other generations. And so there are what we call 4 foundational harms of the phone-based life that are unique to the phone-based life, but happen to both boys and girls here. And so the first is social deprivation. And this is in part what you're talking about, that beginning in it began a little earlier than the 2010s, but what happened right around 2010 is that kids started spending far less time with each other in person. So you have this survey called the American Time Use Survey. And in the early 2000s, this is among 15 to 24-year-olds, they were spending approximately 2 hours, a little bit more per day with people in person, with friends in person. This is not counting time at school or work. By 2018, this is before the COVID pandemic, we're getting down now to around 30 minutes. It's happening. Kids are spending the same amount of time with each other that 50-year-olds are spending with each other. And so this is just a massive change in the amount of time that kids are spending with each other, doing things with each other, going out with each other. And so that's one major change that happened during this period. The second is sleep deprivation. Kids today are also sleeping much less than they were 10 years ago. This is another issue that had been rising beforehand, but it really accelerates in this over the last decade, where the percent of teens sleeping less than 7 hours a day shot up. So we have social deprivation, sleep deprivation, attention fragmentation is number 3. And this is really quite striking to me, that on average, kids get about 237 notifications per day on average. And then I believe it was 15% said that they get around 500 notifications per day. And if we just take this in waking hours, for the 500, that's about 1 one notification every 2 minutes, every 3 minutes. It's an enormous amount of notifications, and it is just a distraction machine. We are being pulled away 24 hours of the day to our phones in constant partial attention. We're not, and this is for adults and for kids, that we are just pulled constantly between 1,000 things, and it makes it very hard to think deeply and to focus on the people around us, and the same, not just for kids, also for parents to focus on their kids. We are constantly being pulled. And the fourth harm are behavioral addictions. The way that these platforms, social media, modern video games are designed in ways to maximize the amount of time that is being spent on these platforms and maximize the amount of engagement. And so you can see this in things like the autoplay on YouTube or the infinite scroll on Twitter. These are design features specifically made to keep people on longer than they want to. And for kids who are particularly vulnerable, in part because their brains are not fully developed, their frontal cortex, which helps with executive function, impulse control, they're taken advantage of here. And so when we put all of this together, these 4 foundational harms plus these unique harms that are coming from social media that I discussed before, it has led to a generation that is much more fearful, much more risk averse, much less just ready to deal with life in the real world, and really struggling. And so, for example, the suicide rate among Gen Z girls is higher today than any other generation previously recorded, and this is true across the 5 Anglosphere countries.
You collected a lot of quantitative data. Did you also collect qualitative data to know how Gen Z is feeling about their digital world?
It's a great question. And so our focus for this book was really we did do some qualitative work, but to be honest, I want to do much more. That's an area that, we need to do more of, but we read everything that we could find in terms of different reports that have been out, qualitative studies. And the key thing that I want to argue is that there are, of course, some benefits to online life, and especially when we're not talking about social media platforms. But what I believe is happening is that kids are stuck in a trap, in a social trap. And there are a few different traps that are here. The first is the fact that as kids are being pulled away from the real world by overprotection and overstructuring, there's nobody to play with out in the world, to just, go out and play. And so the allure to the virtual world is very strong. It promises connection. It promises fun and all of these things. And so, kids flocked over to these virtual platforms. And then once you're on the platforms, they hook you, right? They get you and they keep you there. And not only do they keep you there, what happens is that your entire social world becomes dependent on these platforms. And so if you want to decide as an individual kid I'm going to get off of Instagram because it doesn't feel good ultimately for me. What could end up happening, and it happens a lot, is that kids feel more disconnected once they're off of it because everybody else is on these platforms. And so the pressure to stay on, even for those who are not on, is extremely strong. And so, yes, some kids might say that they like being online, but in part it's because they have to be online in order to stay connected. And this is the trap that they're in. And why is it a trap and not just another way that kids can interact with each other is we can look at some studies. A recent 2023 study found that this is among college students, they asked them, if you were to, the researchers asked the participants, they said, how much money would it cost to get off of TikTok and Instagram for a month? How much would we have to pay you? And the average was around $50 more or less for for TikTok and Instagram. Then they asked the question again, and they said, okay, how much would we have to pay you if we got you off the platform, but also everybody else in your community? The response was, we would pay the researchers. The participants would pay the researchers to do this. Meaning, just like to hit it hard, is that they don't want to be there, but they're only there because everybody else is there. And that's what the collective action problem is that doing something individually has a high cost. But when you do it collectively, the benefits increase. But nobody wants to be the first one to make that move because, well, what if other kids don't leave? And this is the cycle that we're in, and no parent wants to be the one to make their kid more disconnected. And so this really brings us to our solutions that we recommend, but is we need to find ways to break out of the social trap.
Yeah, so you mentioned the notion of a collective action problem. As I told you, I made a YouTube series about it last summer, and I'm hoping that an increasing amount of people see our contemporary problems through this lens. That's interesting because you can see collective action problem at multiple levels. So there's a collective action problem at the level of the users, as you said it, with this really interesting study. And there's also a collective action problem at the level of the companies. Like when we think about the addictiveness of platforms, when TikTok came out with this new algorithm and with these very short videos, it created a really strong incentive for all the other companies to copy TikTok and to also make a platform that is more addictive. If not, you lose your place in the market. You lose economic advantage. So that creates this race to the bottom of the brainstem. I know I know that you work for the Center for Humane Technology, so
yeah, I love it throwing out these quotes from Tristan.
yeah. So I learned my lessons. So yeah, it's really interesting to see these problems at multiple levels. And the study that you mentioned is, I think, really important for people to know because it says so much about our current situation with technology.
Yeah, and the reason why I'm focusing on the collective action problem among teens and less among companies, because you're totally right that there is that companies are also caught in this collective action trap. The reason I'm focusing on teens is that there is so much that we can do as individuals, as parents, as teachers, to be done without having to change the tech companies or without having to change government policy. Because both of those things are going to take a lot of time and are difficult. They are happening, but we can do this in our own communities. So just the four major ways that we believe that we can break out of these collective action traps is setting a set of new norms for families and also for schools. And those new norms are, the first is that we need to delay. We need to delay smartphones until age 14. And if you can do that with your own community, hooking up with other parents of your kids' friends, and you say, we're going to delay till 14 together. Now they have kids to play with, and you're setting a new standard that others can follow. Delaying social media till 16 is the second, and it's the same kind of principle, delaying past those periods where there's the greatest risk of harm, and giving kids their childhood back. The third is targeted towards educators and schools, where we're really pushing for true phone-free policies, where kids come in, you give the phone, at the beginning of the day, and then you get the phone back at the end of the day. You can use phone lockers or phone pouches, but a way to, it's crazy to expect that you just say, here's this addictive device, put it in your backpack, but don't check it. And you're going to get in trouble if you check it. It's a terrible policy, and it only creates more conflict. We need to divorce, our extra limb of our phone from our body and put it into a locker for the day. So that's norm number 3. And norm number 4 is really bringing back and restoring the play-based childhood, the more responsibility, independence, free play in the real world. And the only way that's going to happen is through community, building community with your neighbors, with your friends, finding places where this could happen. And also in schools, that schools could set up what are called play clubs, really simple things, beginning or end of the day, after or before school, opening up the playground for 30 minutes, an hour, and you have just one person that's lightly supervising. You're the lifeguard, not the referee. And kids get just some of that experience that many of us had when we were growing up. The last thing I just want to mention, I forgot, is consider buying flip phones, right? We don't have to go completely phone free. Flip phones didn't seem to cause much harm to millennials when they were growing up. It's ways that you can still contact your kids, but they don't have the same addictive properties as smartphones do.
John Haidt co-founded the LetGrow organization. Can you tell us a bit about it? Do you have some feedback from parents and kids that participate in this experiment?
Yeah, so the LetGrow Project is a nonprofit organization designed to bring back the play-based childhood, to give kids the independence and responsibility that they need to thrive. And it's founded by Lenore Skenazy, who is considered the world's worst mom, in air quotes. And she, because she let her, I believe he was, I don't remember how old he was.
I think he was 9, no? Something
Yeah,
like
yeah, 9 years old, to ride on the New York subway all by himself to get home, and it caused a news frenzy. But the big idea there, it was what built off of it, was how do we create the conditions to allow kids to have these kinds of experiences? Because when they do, they're incredibly profound. And one project at LetGrow, it's called the LetGrow Experience that they do. And it's a homework assignment that happens at school where kids are told, go home and do something that you haven't done before without your parents being there. Try something new. And some kids have taken that they're going to go and walk the dog on their own. They can be in elementary school and walk down the street. Or I'm going to try to, I just heard this one story the other day of, what was it? Learning how to spray paint. And a kid was in the basement, like spray painting the wall, but you don't have to do that one. But the general thing that we've heard again and again and again is when kids go out and do something on their own, maybe it's also going to a store and going to buy some milk for the family, that the effects are really profound, and it happens very quickly. Because again, and this goes back to my story at the beginning about when I went to the wilderness therapy program, and that what changes is not only that you start to feel internally a little bit more competent, that you're a little bit more capable than you thought you were, but also other people start to see that in you. And it creates this new feedback loop, or even if you are kind of a struggling kid or whatever it is, you can start to build little by little as you grow up this sense of, I'm more than my anxiety, I'm more than the hardships, and I can handle these hardships of life, and I'm surrounded by loving people who are going to support me through that. And that's really what LetGrow is all about.
You are currently working on another book with Jonathan Haidt named Life After Babel, Adapting to a World We No Longer Share. Really quickly, why did you choose the metaphor of Babel to name the book? And can you tell us a bit more about this project?
Yeah, so we have a Substack that is called After Babel. And so if readers want to read it, you can go check it out. But that Substack was based on an Atlantic article that John wrote that was originally supposed to be titled Life After Babel. And what that Atlantic article was, the main insight is that we had built new digital technologies, communication technologies that became ever more powerful. And we got to a point right around 2010 or so, again, where we had the capacity to communicate across the world. We could talk to anyone. We can learn anything. And we were at a peak of techno-optimism, right? The Soviet Union fell in the 90s, and the Silicon Valley in the United States was emerging and becoming this tech powerhouse. It seemed like technology and social media and all of this was a boon to democracies around the world, a boon to communication. And John's argument is that, you know, the tower, we built the Tower of Babel where we can communicate with everyone. We reached the heavens, and then the tower crumbled. And the tower crumbled as these social media platforms transformed to become much more, again, addictive, much more polarizing, much more disorienting, where it becomes extremely difficult to know what is true and to understand one another, as we're all living in different different bubbles online, but also sometimes seeing other people's ideas, but it's just in the most outrageous and extreme ways that only fuel our own dislike of the other side or the other team. And John's core argument is that we're going to have to live in a world and learn to live in a world where we simply cannot understand each other. And how do we do that? And that is the topic of our next book.
Okay, can't wait to read it. Zach, is there anything that we didn't talk about and that you would like to add to the conversation?
No, I think this was great. I really appreciate the time, and thanks to all your listeners for listening. And, you know, the book again comes out March 26th, and would love to get feedback. So you can check out the anxiousgeneration.com and tell us.
Sure, we'll do feedback. Thank you, Zach. It's been a pleasure. And yeah, I hope we can keep in touch in the future, and we will do a part 2 for the second book.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you very much.